The world we call medieval did not arrive all at once. It came slowly, the way a season changes, almost imperceptibly at first, and then one day you notice the light is different, the air has shifted, and something that once was familiar has become something else entirely. The Roman world had been a world of roads and order, of aqueducts carrying water across long distances, of legions keeping watch at the edges of an enormous empire that stretched from the deserts of northern Africa to the rainy hills of what we now call England. And for a very long time, that world had felt permanent, the way the mountains feel permanent, the way the slow movement of rivers feels like something that will always be there. But empires, like all things made by human hands and human effort, are subject to the quiet pressures of time. They do not usually fall the way a tree falls in a storm, sudden and loud and complete. They tend instead to thin out, like morning fog as the sun rises, until one day the roads are less well maintained, the messages take longer to arrive, the soldiers at the distant outposts receive their supplies a little less reliably. And so, across several generations, the world that had been Roman began very gradually to become something else, something quieter and more local, something we would eventually call medieval. The word medieval simply means the Middle Ages, from the Latin words for middle and age, and it refers to the long span of centuries between the classical world of Rome and Greece and the period of renewed artistic and intellectual activity we call the Renaissance. Scholars generally place the beginning of the Middle Ages somewhere in the 5th century and the end somewhere around the 15th, though these boundaries are soft and blurry and historians debate them pleasantly. What matters more than the precise dates is the feeling of the era, the texture of daily life, the quiet rhythms of the world that most people inhabited. Because most people in the Middle Ages did not live in the centers of political power. They did not live in palaces or great stone fortresses. They lived in villages, small and close and self-contained, surrounded by fields and woods, by the paths worn into the earth by generations of feet walking the same routes to the same places. Life in a medieval village had a quality of deep repetition to it, a cycling through the same tasks in the same seasons year after year, and there is something in that repetition that the mind can rest in, like the sound of rain that falls steadily through the night. The typical village in early medieval Europe was not a large place. It might have held 30 or 40 families, perhaps fewer, clustered together for the simple practical reasons of community and shared labor. The houses were built from whatever materials were close at hand. In areas where trees were plentiful, timber frames were common, filled in with wattle and daub, which was a mixture of woven sticks and mud and straw that dried into a reasonably solid wall. In areas where stone was easily found, the houses might have stone walls, low and thick, built to hold warmth in the winter months. The roofs were most often thatched, made from bundles of dried straw or reeds layered densely enough to keep out rain. A well-made thatch roof could last for many years, and the skill of the thatcher, the person who laid and maintained these roofs, was valued in the community. The interior of a typical house was a single large room, perhaps divided at one end by a low partition, where the family might keep their animals during the coldest months. The floor was hard-packed earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or dried herbs that gave off a faint pleasant smell underfoot. In the center of the room or near one wall there would be a hearth, simply an open fire on a flat stone surface, the smoke rising to find its way out through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. The fire was the center of household life in a way that is difficult to fully imagine now. It provided warmth, of course, but also light as the evenings grew dark, and it was the source of all cooking, the place where the pot hung on its iron hook or the flat bread was baked on a stone surface. The fire was tended carefully, banked at night so that it would still hold coals in the morning, and a family that let their fire go completely cold faced the laborious task of rekindling it from scratch, perhaps borrowing a flame from a neighbor. The furniture inside these homes was simple and functional. A wooden table, sometimes just a board laid across two supports. Stools or benches rather than chairs with backs. A chest for storing clothing and small valuable possessions, which served also as an extra seat or a surface to work on. Beds were often just raised platforms of wood with a stuffed mattress on top, filled with straw or dried grasses or, for those who could afford it, wool. Everyone in the family might sleep in the same room, close together for warmth, the animals just on the other side of the partition, their body heat contributing something to the overall temperature of the space. Outside, the village was organized around its fields, and the fields were organized by a system that served the community as a whole. In many parts of Europe, particularly in the central and northern regions, a version of what historians call the open field system was common. The land surrounding the village was divided into large fields, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, and these fields were in turn divided into long narrow strips. Each family in the village held strips scattered across the fields rather than concentrated in one place, which meant that everyone shared equally in both the better and the poorer land, in the low wet spots and the well-drained higher ground. Each year, in the three-field system, one field would be planted with a winter grain like wheat or rye, another with a spring crop like oats or barley or legumes, and the third would be left fallow, allowed to rest without any crop at all. The next year the cycle would shift, so that no field was planted in the same thing 2 years in a row, and every field had its fallow year regularly. This rotation helped the soil recover some of what the crops took from it, and while the people of the Middle Ages did not use the language of soil chemistry or nitrogen cycles, they understood through long observation and inherited knowledge that land needed to rest in order to remain productive. The pace of farm work followed the sun and the seasons with a steadiness that modern life rarely mirrors. In the very early spring, as the ground softened and the light began to lengthen in the afternoons, the ploughing began. The heavy clay soils of northern Europe required a substantial plough, the kind pulled by oxen, slow and patient animals whose strength was suited to the long hours of turning earth. A team of oxen pulling a plough through a field moved at a walking pace that was almost meditative, the plough cutting its furrow, the earth turning over in long dark ribbons, the birds following close behind to find what the turned soil revealed. After ploughing came sowing, walking the length of the field scattering seed from a basket or a fold of cloth, the seed falling in a gentle arc across the fresh-turned ground. This too was slow work, rhythmic and repetitive, requiring a practiced hand and an even stride to distribute the seed neither too thickly nor too thinly. Then came the long weeks of waiting, of watching the sky for rain, of watching the ground for the first green signs of germination, a patient watching that had its own quality of calm attention. Summer brought the weeding and the tending, and then as the days reached their longest and the grain began to ripen, the whole community prepared for the harvest. Harvest was the most labor-intensive time of the agricultural year, when the grain had to be cut and gathered before autumn rains could damage it. The tools were simple, the sickle and later the scythe, and the work was done by hand, everyone who was able joining in, moving through the fields in a slow communal effort. Children old enough to work walked behind the cutters, gathering the fallen grain into armfuls and tying it into sheaves. The sheaves were then stacked into rows to dry before being gathered and taken to the threshing floor. Threshing, the process of separating the grain from the straw, was done by beating the sheaves against a wooden surface or striking them repeatedly with a hinged stick called a flail. It was methodical, repetitive work, done in a barn or a covered threshing floor, the steady rhythmic sound of the flail rising and falling, the grain gradually accumulating on the floor while the empty straw was set aside. Then came winnowing, tossing the grain into the air so that a light breeze could carry away the chaff while the heavier grain fell back into the pile. Watching grain being winnowed on a light autumn day, the chaff drifting in pale clouds, has a peaceful quality to it, as if the air itself is doing gentle patient work. Autumn also brought other harvests. The gardens that most households kept produced vegetables through the growing season, and now the things that would last through winter were being gathered and stored. Turnips and other root vegetables could be kept in a cool cellar. Apples and pears, where they grew, were picked and some stored carefully in straw, others pressed into juice that might be allowed to ferment gently into cider. Herbs were dried and hung in bunches from the rafters, filling the house with their dry, faintly dusty fragrance. In many communities, the autumn also brought the pig slaughter, a practical necessity since feeding a pig through the winter was costly and the cold weather made the preservation of meat possible in a way the warmer months did not allow. The work of butchering and salting and smoking the meat was a significant undertaking, and much of the pig was preserved in one form or another to provide protein through the winter months. Nothing was wasted. The fat rendered down for cooking. The intestines cleaned and used as casings for sausages. The bones boiled for broth. It was a kind of thoroughgoing economy that found a use for everything, not out of philosophy but out of the simple practical reality that nothing came easily enough to be discarded. Winter, when the fields were empty and the ground frozen, was a quieter time, though not an idle one. The animals needed feeding and tending every day. Fences and tools needed mending. Cloth needed spinning and weaving. By firelight on long evenings, the household occupied itself with a work that did not require daylight or outdoor conditions, the distaff and spindle turning, the loom threading slowly, the sound of needles moving through fabric. These were tasks that could be done in companionable nearness, several people working together in the warmth of the same fire, talking quietly or not talking, simply present in the shared activity. Children in these villages grew up surrounded by the rhythms of this life. They began helping with small tasks early, gathering eggs, carrying water, watching over younger siblings, tending the family's geese or other small animals. As they grew older, they took on more substantial work, joining the older workers in the fields, learning the practical knowledge that would sustain them as adults. Much of what needed to be known was passed down through observation and imitation rather than formal teaching. A child watching her mother spin thread year after year would come to understand the tension and the rhythm of the work long before her own hands were asked to do it. There were, in most villages, people who held particular roles based on specialized knowledge or skill. The blacksmith was essential, a person who could work iron into the tools and hardware that the community depended on. The miller, who operated the mill where grain was ground into flour, occupied an important position in village life. The carpenter, the person who knew herbs and their uses, who could be called upon when someone was unwell. In small communities, these specialists served the whole village, and the nature of their work set them somewhat apart from the pure agricultural labor that occupied most of the population. The village as a community was also shaped by forces larger than itself, by the structure of landholding and obligation that historians call feudalism, though the reality was more varied and complex than the tidy diagrams in textbooks suggest. In its simplest form, the land was held by someone, perhaps a local lord, perhaps a more distant noble, sometimes the church, and those who worked the land held it in exchange for obligations. These might include days of labor on the lord's own fields, a portion of the harvest, fees at certain times of year, and various other customary dues that had accumulated over generations. The lord or landowner held the land from someone above him in the social hierarchy, and so the arrangement extended upward, each level holding in exchange for some form of service or payment to the level above. At the very top of this structure sat the king, who in theory was the ultimate source of all landowning authority, holding his realm as a kind of sacred trust, though the practical realities of medieval kingship were far more tangled and negotiated than this suggests. The great majority of medieval people were, in one way or another, tied to the land they worked. Some were free in a legal sense and could in theory move and make decisions about their own labor. Others were bound more firmly, in a condition called serfdom, where leaving the land or marrying without permission required the approval of the lord. The exact nature of these obligations varied enormously from place to place and time to time, and the lived experience of a serf in one part of England might have been quite different from the lived experience of a serf in a distant part of France or Germany. But what is perhaps most striking about the social world of the medieval village, viewed from our great distance, is not so much the hierarchy or the obligations, but the density of community life. People lived in close proximity, knew each other across generations, shared the work and the celebrations and the sorrows of a life spent in the same small place. The community had its own internal culture, its own stories and customs and expectations, passed down through the years in the way that small communities accumulate culture, slowly and without anyone necessarily being aware that it is happening. The Church played a central role in this community life in a way that is difficult to separate out from everything else, because in the medieval world the boundary between religious life and ordinary daily life was not a clear one. The rhythm of the Church year structured time in a way that was felt by everyone. The great feasts of the Christian calendar, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the many saints' days distributed throughout the year, served as markers of the passing of time, as occasions for rest from labor, and as moments of communal gathering and celebration. The village church, often the most substantial building in the settlement, was the center of this community religious life. In stone or timber, sometimes quite modest in scale, sometimes surprisingly elaborate considering the resources available, the church was where the community gathered for the major moments of life, baptism and marriage and burial, and also for the regular Sunday services that punctuated each week with a moment of shared ritual. The interior of the church might be painted with images from Scripture and the lives of the saints, vivid colors on white plaster, providing a kind of visual instruction for people who could not read. The priest who served the village was often a local person, perhaps the son of a local family who had received some education and ordination, and his learning might not be tremendously extensive, but he was the person who could read, who knew the Latin of the church services, who connected the village to the wider institution of the church that extended beyond any individual community. In many ways the village priest occupied a position somewhat similar to that of any other local craftsman, a person with specialized skills and knowledge that the community depended upon. Beyond the village, the world of the Middle Ages was organized around a number of larger centers, the towns that served as markets and administrative points and centers of craft production. Medieval towns, particularly in the earlier centuries, were often quite small by modern standards, just a few thousand inhabitants, but they were genuinely urban in their density and complexity compared to the scattered villages of the countryside. Streets lined with timber-framed buildings, workshops opening onto the street, the sounds and smells of craft production, of tanning and baking and metalworking, mingling in the narrow lanes. The market was the heart of the town, the place where the products of the countryside and the products of urban craftspeople came together and were exchanged. Market days, usually once or twice a week in a typical medieval town, were occasions when the surrounding countryside would come to town, farmers bringing their surplus produce, craftspeople offering their goods, buyers and sellers negotiating over prices in the way that markets have always operated. The market square was noisy and busy and full of a particular kind of energy, the energy of exchange and encounter. The craft guilds that organized the production of various goods in medieval towns were institutions of considerable importance. A guild brought together all the practitioners of a particular craft, the weavers, the shoemakers, the goldsmiths, the bakers, setting standards for the quality of work, regulating who could practice the craft and under what conditions, and providing a social structure for the people involved. Entry into a guild followed a defined path. A young person would enter as an apprentice, living in the household of a master craftsman and learning the trade over a number of years. If they progressed, they would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who could be hired by others but had not yet achieved the status of master. Eventually, if they could demonstrate their skill and meet the guild's requirements, they might become a master themselves, able to take on apprentices and run their own workshop. The products of these workshops, the cloth, the metalwork, the leather goods, the pottery, were made with a thoroughness and care that came from this system of long training and quality control. A piece of medieval metalwork that has survived to the present often displays a level of craftsmanship that invites close examination, the intricate patterns worked with fine tools, the balance and proportion achieved through skill and practice. These objects were made to last, and many of them have lasted, carried gently through the centuries to reach us. The great castles that punctuate our image of the medieval world were, of course, not present everywhere. They were primarily the residences and strongholds of the nobility, the upper levels of the feudal hierarchy, and they evolved considerably over the course of the Middle Ages. The earliest Norman castles in England, built after the conquest of 1066, were often simple in construction, an earthen mound called a motte topped with a wooden tower and surrounded by a fenced enclosure. These could be built relatively quickly and served the immediate practical need of establishing a point of control in newly conquered territory. As time went on and as stone became the building material of choice for permanent fortifications, castles grew more complex and more permanent. The great stone keeps that survive from the 12th and 13th centuries are massive and impressive even in their current ruined state, with walls sometimes 3 or 4 meters thick, built to resist the assault techniques available at the time. Inside, the castle keep was divided into floors, each serving different functions: storage and servants' quarters at the lower levels, the great hall for eating and gathering and conducting business in the middle, the private chambers of the lord and his family at the upper levels. Life inside a castle was not quite as it appears in the romantic imagination. The great hall, for instance, was a genuinely communal space. Meals were taken there with a considerable number of people present, the lord and his family at the high table at one end of the hall, various levels of household staff and retainers at the lower tables. The fire in the central hearth of the hall, or later in a fireplace set into the wall, provided heat to a large space that was not always entirely comfortable in winter. The stone walls, while excellent for defense, did not retain warmth particularly well, and the higher you went in a stone castle, the colder it tended to be. The tapestries and hangings that decorated the walls of wealthy medieval interiors were not purely decorative. They served the practical purpose of insulation, reducing the chill that radiated from the stone walls, and adding both warmth and color to rooms that might otherwise have felt quite bare and cold. The textile arts were highly valued in the medieval world, and fine needlework and weaving were considered appropriate accomplishments for noble women as well as for the craftspeople who produced them commercially. The gardens attached to castles and monasteries were carefully maintained spaces that served both practical and aesthetic purposes. Herb gardens provided the medicinal and culinary plants that every household needed. Kitchen gardens grew the vegetables that supplemented the diet. And beyond these practical spaces, the enclosed pleasure gardens of the wealthy, with their raised beds and trellised roses and the sound of small fountains in warm months, were spaces designed for quiet enjoyment and the pleasure of growing things. The monasteries that were scattered throughout the medieval landscape were in many ways the intellectual and cultural centers of their era, particularly in the earlier centuries before universities developed. Within the monastery, the day was structured entirely around a cycle of prayer and work that left little room for idleness but also gave the monastic day a kind of settled order. The 7 canonical hours of prayer, from the early morning office of matins through the evening service of compline, punctuated the day with regular moments of communal worship, the monks gathering in the church to chant the psalms in their ancient rhythmic patterns. Between the hours of prayer, the monks worked. Some worked in the fields or gardens, the physical labor of keeping the monastery fed. Some worked in the scriptorium, the writing room where manuscripts were copied and decorated. This was slow, careful work, the monk sitting at his writing desk with his quill pen and his carefully prepared parchment, copying out the words of Scripture or the texts of ancient authors letter by letter in a hand trained to precision and clarity. It might take a monk a year or more to copy a single substantial book, and the care taken was evident in the surviving manuscripts, in the even columns of text, the initial letters decorated with color and gold, the margins sometimes filled with the smaller, more personal marks of the individual scribe, a note about the weather, a sigh of tiredness, a small drawing in the margin. The library of a monastery was a repository of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. The books were expensive and irreplaceable, each one representing months or years of labor, and they were treated accordingly, stored carefully, chained to the reading desks in some libraries to prevent their removal. A monastic library of several hundred volumes was a significant collection, and the monks who had access to it had access to a range of knowledge about theology, history, natural philosophy, medicine, and the arts that was simply not available to people outside the Church's educational structures. The education provided within monasteries and cathedral schools was the foundation from which the universities of the later Middle Ages grew. The first universities, in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, began to coalesce in the 12th and 13th centuries, gathering students from wide areas who came to study under particular teachers whose reputations had spread. The subjects of study were organized into what the medieval tradition called the 7 liberal arts, the basic curriculum of grammar, rhetoric, and logic on one side, and arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy on the other, providing a foundation for the more advanced study of theology, law, and medicine. The scholars who populated these early universities engaged with a tradition of learning that was in the process of recovering and reintegrating works of ancient Greek philosophy and science, often arriving in Europe through Arabic translations made in the Islamic world. The works of Aristotle, in particular, exercised an enormous influence on medieval intellectual life, providing a framework for systematic thinking about the natural world, about logic and ethics and politics, that medieval thinkers worked to reconcile with Christian theology. This was patient, careful work, carried out in the language of Latin across boundaries of time and culture, and it produced a body of thought that was genuinely sophisticated in its attempts to bring together different streams of knowledge into a coherent whole. The cathedrals that were built in the great cities of medieval Europe were the largest building projects of their time, expressions of religious devotion and civic pride that took generations to complete. A cathedral begun in the 12th century might not be finished until the 14th or 15th, meaning that the people who laid the foundations never saw the completed building, and the people who installed the final windows or finished the last tower had been born long after the project began. This multi-generational quality of the great cathedrals is one of the things that makes them feel so profound. The accumulated labor and faith of so many generations of workers and donors and worshippers built into the stone itself. The development of Gothic architecture, with its pointed arches and its flying buttresses that transferred the weight of the roof outward and downward rather than pressing directly on the walls, made it possible to build walls that were thinner and taller and filled with large windows. Those windows, filled with stained glass in deep blues and reds and greens, created an interior light that was unlike anything available in ordinary life, a colored and transformed light that fell in shifting patterns across the stone floors and seemed to carry with it something of the quality of the transcendent. Standing in a Gothic cathedral on a bright day, watching the light move slowly across the floor as the sun travels across the sky, has a quality of deep peace to it, a sense of being held within something much larger than oneself. The ordinary lives of medieval people were marked by a relationship to the natural world that was close and immediate in ways that most modern life is not. The turning of the seasons was not merely a background to daily experience but its actual structure. The quality of the light in different seasons, the sounds of different months, the animals and plants and birds that appeared and disappeared with the changing year, these were all part of a familiar natural world that was directly experienced every day. The swallows arriving in spring after their long absence. The first frost silvering the grass on an autumn morning. the deep quiet of a landscape under snow. These were not scenic experiences viewed from a distance but the actual texture of everyday life. Medieval people understood the sky in ways that we have largely lost. Without artificial light, the night sky was genuinely dark, and the stars were as familiar as neighbors, their rising and setting through the seasons providing a kind of celestial calendar. The phases of the moon, the movements of the planets against the background of the stars, were things that literate and illiterate people alike observed and took into account. Agricultural calendars incorporated the positions of particular stars as indicators of the right time for various tasks. The midsummer rise of certain star groups told the farmer when particular work needed to begin. The relationship of medieval people to time itself was different from our own. Without mechanical clocks for most of the period, time was measured in looser, more natural units. The canonical hours of the church provided a rough structure to the day, the bells of the church or monastery sounding across the town or village at intervals, but these intervals were not the precise equal hours of a modern clock. They varied with the season, since the period of daylight was divided into a certain number of hours regardless of whether the days were long or short. A summer hour was longer than a winter hour. Time breathed with the season in a way that mechanical timekeeping later made impossible. The economy of the medieval world, particularly in its earlier centuries, was substantially local. Most of what people ate and wore and used was produced within a relatively small radius of where they lived. Long-distance trades certainly existed, particularly in luxury goods that could not be produced everywhere, fine cloth, spices from distant lands, quality metalwork, but these things touched the lives of ordinary people only at the edges. The everyday economy was the exchange of local goods and services, the farmer trading grain for the blacksmith's work, the payment of dues in kind rather than in money, the complex web of mutual obligation and exchange that kept the village community functioning. As the Middle Ages progressed, however, trade expanded considerably. The revival of towns, the growth of craft production, the development of merchant networks that stretched across considerable distances, these were all part of a gradual economic expansion that accelerated particularly from the 11th century onward. The great fairs of medieval Europe, like the famous fairs in the Champagne region of France, brought together merchants from many different places, facilitating the exchange of goods from across the known world and developing, gradually, the financial instruments and techniques that would eventually underpin the modern economy. Merchants who traveled these long distances carried with them not just goods but also information, news of distant places and events, knowledge of different techniques and products and customs. They were in a sense mediators between different worlds, people whose professional lives required them to be comfortable with difference and change in a way that the settled agricultural life of the village did not. The merchant class occupied an interesting and sometimes uncomfortable position in the medieval social imagination, valued for the goods and the trade they brought, but also regarded with some suspicion as people who profited from exchange rather than from labor or governance or prayer. The food of the medieval period was shaped by what the land and the season produced, by the practical constraints of preservation, and by the social distinctions that determined who ate what. For the majority of the population, the diet was substantial in grains and legumes, bread and pottage, a thick porridge or soup made from whatever grains and vegetables were available, sometimes enlivened with herbs, sometimes thickened with oats or barley. Meat was less frequent in the diet of ordinary people than in the diet of the wealthy, not because they did not value it but because raising animals for slaughter required resources and land that not everyone had access to. The diet of the wealthy was quite different, centered on meat in considerable variety, enlivened with spices that signaled wealth and sophistication, prepared with a level of elaboration that required a substantial kitchen staff. Medieval recipes that survive from aristocratic households describe dishes of considerable complexity, combining sweet and savory elements, using spices like ginger and cinnamon and saffron in combinations that would seem unusual to modern palates, finishing sauces with vinegar or verjuice to provide a sharp note of acidity. Food was not merely fuel in this context but a statement of status and hospitality, and the great feast that a lord might provide for his household and guests was as much a social performance as a meal. The beverages of the medieval period were also quite different from what most of us drink today. Water, though of course everyone drank it, was regarded with some caution, not entirely without reason given that water sources in towns and villages could be contaminated. Ale, brewed from grain without hops in the early period, was the everyday drink of most people, including children, who drank it in a thin and only mildly alcoholic form. Wine was drunk by those who could afford it and in the regions where grapes grew. Mead, made from fermented honey, was an older drink that retained a certain ceremonial significance. Cider in apple-growing regions. Herbal infusions and tisanes for medicinal purposes. The dress of medieval people varied as much as everything else according to social position and period. At the simplest level, a peasant's clothing might consist of a woolen tunic, hose or leggings, and simple shoes or boots. The wool would most likely have been spun and woven within the household, the natural colors of the fleece dominant, perhaps sometimes dyed with plant materials to produce colors of brown and soft yellow and muted green. The garments were cut simply, designed for durability and warmth rather than elaborate shape, and they would be worn until they wore out and then repaired and worn again. The clothing of the wealthy was another matter entirely, cut from fine imported fabrics, dyed in brilliant colors that required expensive materials to produce, lined with fur, trimmed with embroidery. The variety and elaboration of fashionable dress increased considerably over the course of the medieval period, particularly from the 13th century onward, and the records of the period document with some bemusement the elaborate styles that came and went, the impossibly long toes of fashionable shoes at certain periods, the extraordinary heights of some women's headdresses, the tight doublets and short tunics that older commentators criticized as immodest. Fashion, it seems, is not an invention of the modern world. The care of the body in the medieval period has sometimes been caricatured as entirely neglected, but the reality was more varied than that. Bathing certainly happened, whether in large wooden tubs filled with heated water in wealthier households, or in rivers and streams in the summer months, or in the bathhouses that existed in many medieval towns, where people could pay for the use of heated water. Hair was combed and maintained. Teeth were cleaned with various preparations. Physicians wrote about the importance of cleanliness for health, and while the understanding of disease was quite different from our own, the intuition that cleanliness was connected to well-being was present. Medieval medicine was built on a theoretical framework inherited from classical antiquity, particularly the ideas associated with the ancient physician Galen, who in turn built on even older Greek traditions. The central concept was that of the four humours, bodily fluids whose balance was considered the foundation of health. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were understood to be present in the body in varying proportions, and illness was attributed to imbalances among them. Treatments aimed at restoring balance, whether through changes in diet, through herbal remedies, through bloodletting, or through other interventions. This framework was not, of course, correct in the ways that modern medicine understands the body. But within its own terms it was a coherent and systematic attempt to understand human health and illness, and practitioners who worked within it could be genuinely helpful in cases where the treatments they applied happened to be beneficial even if not for the reasons they believed. Herbal medicine in particular represents a vast accumulated empirical knowledge of which plants had effects on the body, knowledge built up over centuries of observation and use, and some of the remedies in medieval herbals do have pharmacological effects that modern science has confirmed. The lives of women in the medieval period were as varied as the social world they inhabited. At the lower end of the social scale, women worked alongside men in the fields and in the household, doing the same heavy physical labor as well as the additional domestic work of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and textile production. Women worked as broughs, as traders in markets, as midwives and healers. In craft guilds, women participated, sometimes in their own guilds, sometimes alongside male members. The notion that medieval women were simply domestic and passive does not hold up to examination. At the higher social levels, aristocratic women exercised considerable authority within their domains, managing estates when their husbands were absent, which was often given the demands of military service and administrative travel. The wives of merchants and prosperous craftspeople were partners in the family business in a practical sense, often taking over the management of affairs when a husband died. The letters and records that survive from medieval women reveal people who were active, thoughtful, and capable, navigating the constraints of their world with intelligence and pragmatism. The arts of the medieval world, painting and sculpture and music and literature, developed over the centuries from styles that were closely tied to religious purposes toward something more varied and complex. The earliest medieval painting was almost entirely in the service of the church, the figures of saints and sacred scenes rendered in stylized forms that conveyed theological meaning rather than naturalistic representation. The goal was not to show what a person looked like but to indicate who they were and what they signified, and the gold backgrounds and the formal poses and the lack of perspective were not failures of technique but features of a different approach to visual representation. As the Middle Ages progressed, the visual arts developed toward a greater interest in the natural world and in the representation of individual human experience. The sculptures of the great Gothic cathedrals show figures with increasing individuality of expression, the folds of drapery rendered with careful attention to how fabric actually falls, the faces showing something of the variety of human emotion. In manuscript illumination, the decorated pages of books produced in the later medieval period, there is sometimes an extraordinary attention to the natural world, tiny and precise images of real plants and insects and birds filling the margins, a quiet celebration of the observed world rendered with great skill. Medieval music is music that we can still hear, because enough notation survived that modern performers have been able to reconstruct it. The plain chant of the church, the long flowing melodic lines sung by monastic choirs, has a quality that modern listeners often find unexpectedly moving, a simplicity and directness that seems to carry something of the spaces where it was first sung. The development of polyphony, the simultaneous singing of different melodic lines in careful harmonic relationship, was one of the great intellectual and aesthetic achievements of the medieval period, the early organum giving way over centuries to the elaborate motets and masses of the later Middle Ages. Secular music, the songs of troubadours and minnesingers and traveling musicians, was part of a parallel tradition of vernacular culture, music made in the everyday languages of the people rather than in Latin. These songs were about love and longing, about the beauty of the natural world in different seasons, about the pleasures of company and celebration, and they survived sometimes because they found their way into written collections, sometimes because later musicians remembered them and passed them on. The tradition of folk music that ran through the medieval period and beyond was the music of ordinary life, the songs sung at work and in celebration, and its traces are in some of what survives. Literature in the vernacular languages grew and flourished across the medieval period. The great epic poems, the Chansons de Roland and the Nibelungenlied and Beowulf, told stories of heroic figures and decisive battles in a style suited to oral performance, the lines carrying their own momentum, the repeated formulas helping both the performer and the audience hold the shape of the story in mind. The romances that developed particularly from the 12th century onward brought a new kind of attention to interiority, to the inner life of characters, to the experience of love and loyalty and loss. The tales of King Arthur and his knights circulated across Europe in many versions, each retelling shaped by the concerns and tastes of the culture that produced it. Dante's great poem, written in the Italian vernacular at the turn of the 14th century, brought the possibilities of literary language to a kind of summit, mapping the entire medieval cosmology in intricate and beautiful verse, moving from the darkness of sin through the purifying ascent of penance to the brilliant light of divine presence. It is a poem that carries within it the entire world of medieval thought and feeling, and it has been read continuously from the time of its composition to our own, moving readers in every generation with its combination of intellectual rigor and emotional truth. The world of the Middle Ages was not a static world. It changed over the centuries in response to the slow pressures of climate, of plague, of economic development, of new ideas encountered through trade and travel. The great catastrophe of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which killed perhaps a third or more of the population of Europe in a few terrible years, remade the world in ways both obvious and subtle. Labor became scarcer and therefore more valuable. Old certainties about social order were shaken. New questions arose about the relationship between the human and the divine. The world that emerged on the other side of that devastation was different from the world that had entered it. But through all the changes, through the slow geological time of the Middle Ages, certain rhythms persisted. The grain still needed to be planted and harvested. The seasons still turned with their familiar sequence of tasks and rest. Children were born and grew and eventually died in the same landscapes that their parents and grandparents had known. The church bells still rang across the fields and the rooftops, marking the hours of a day that was itself embedded in a week and a year and a lifetime, all of it nested within a sense of sacred time that gave even the smallest and most ordinary moments some participation in a larger whole. The medieval world looked at the stars that we look at now, the same constellations wheeling slowly overhead through the long nights. They felt the same change in the air when spring arrived after a long winter. They knew the particular quality of late afternoon light in autumn, golden and slanted, falling across a stubble field after the harvest. They knew the smell of bread baking and the sound of rain on a thatch roof and the way a fire settles in the night, the logs shifting and glowing and gradually becoming the quiet red warmth of coals. What comes to us across all those centuries is not so much the drama and the conflict, not the battles and the treaties and the political maneuverings, but something quieter and more fundamental. The sense of lives lived close to the earth, attentive to the seasons, rooted in community and tradition and the rhythms of work and rest and celebration. The sense of a world where the pace of things was slower, where a piece of cloth took many hours to produce and was therefore valued accordingly, where the distance from one village to the next was a real distance walked on foot across familiar fields, where the years accumulated quietly in the same landscape. There is something in that world, viewed from the great distance that separates us from it, that has the quality of an old photograph, a little blurred at the edges, the colors faded and warm, but the shapes familiar. The houses and the fields. The faces turned toward the light. The slow turning of the seasons, the grain rising and falling, the snow coming and going, the birds returning in spring with their ancient insistence on the world's renewal. It goes on, quietly and without announcement, the world making its slow circle, carrying with it all the lives that have been lived within it and all the ordinary details of those lives, the bread and the wool and the firelight and the stars.